December 1917. A single moment. Over 2,000 dead. Halifax explosion. The wartime secret that leveled a city. Two ships collide in the harbor. But what happens next isn't an accident. It's a catastrophe the government tried to bury. Subscribe for untold World War I stories that changed everything. On the morning of December 6, 1917, Halifax Harbor lay calm under winter skies. Two ships approached each other through the Narrows. The SS Mont-Blanc, a French munitions vessel laden with thousands of tons of explosives destined for the Western Front, and the SS Imo, a Belgian relief ship returning from New York. Neither captain realized they were sailing toward history's largest man-made explosion before the atomic bomb. At 8:45 in the morning, the vessels collided. For 20 minutes, an agonizing silence followed. Dock workers watched smoke curl from the Mont-Blanc's hull. Some even rowed out to investigate, unaware they were approaching a floating bomb. Then, at 9:04 and 35 seconds, the ship detonated with such force that the blast wave flattened everything within a mile radius. Buildings vaporized. Trees snapped like twigs. The explosion killed approximately 1,600 people instantly, with the death toll rising to nearly 2,000 as the days passed. But this catastrophe carried a darker dimension. The Canadian military knew exactly what was aboard that ship. They understood the scale of the disaster unfolding. Yet as survivors froze in the December rubble, as rescue workers pulled bodies from collapsed homes, military officials moved to suppress information about the cargo. The wartime secret had to be protected, even as a city burned and thousands lay dying in the snow. This is the story of how an entire nation's tragedy was nearly buried beneath official silence. The city of Halifax in 1917 was a military nerve center, a vital artery pumping supplies and soldiers toward the battlefields of Europe. Canada had been at war for 3 years, and the maritime provinces bore the weight of this commitment with particular intensity. The harbor, one of the finest natural ports on the Atlantic coast, had become the staging ground for transatlantic convoys, hospital ships, and troop transports. Every day, vessels of every description moved through the Narrows: cargo ships, naval destroyers, merchant marines, and supply boats. The rhythm of wartime commerce never ceased. By December of 1917, the conflict had evolved into a grinding, mechanized struggle that consumed resources at an incomprehensible rate. The Western Front demanded constant replenishment. Ammunition, food, uniforms, medical supplies, and replacement troops flowed steadily from North America across the Atlantic. Halifax's strategic importance had grown immeasurably. The city had transformed from a regional maritime center into one of the most crucial logistical hubs in the entire British Empire. Thousands of soldiers passed through its docks weekly, many never to return home. The SS Mont-Blanc was one of many French vessels operating under British convoy protection. Built in 1906, she was a steel-hulled cargo ship of modest size, displacing approximately 2,300 tons. She had made numerous transatlantic crossings and bore the marks of wartime service, faded paint, worn rigging, and the accumulated grime of multiple ocean voyages. On this particular voyage, she carried a cargo that would ultimately reshape the history of the city she approached. The Mont-Blanc's manifest included supplies destined for the munitions factories and military operations in France. In her hold sat 230 tons of TNT, 60 tons of picric acid, 10 tons of benzol, and approximately 35 tons of gun cotton. These materials represented the industrial output of the war effort, transformed into weaponry and explosives. They were the tools of mechanized destruction, carefully packed and secured for transport. Every ton of explosive material that reached European battlefields meant sustained military operations, extended campaigns, and ultimately prolonged human suffering on an industrial scale. The SS Imo, by contrast, was a Norwegian vessel engaged in relief work. She had been chartered to carry supplies to Belgium, where civilian populations faced severe shortages resulting from the German occupation. The Imo was a larger ship, displacing approximately 4,300 tons, and was operating under the auspices of international humanitarian efforts. She was returning to Belgian relief operations after taking on supplies in North America. Her crew and officers were experienced mariners, accustomed to navigating through busy harbors and complex shipping lanes. December 6, 1917 began as a routine day in Halifax Harbor. The winter weather was cool but manageable, with moderate visibility and relatively calm seas. The harbor pilot system was in place to manage the constant flow of traffic through the Narrows. Ships were required to follow established protocols, signal their intentions, and coordinate their movements to prevent collisions. The harbor had hosted thousands of transits without major incident during the war years. The systems in place, while sometimes stressed by the volume of traffic, had proven adequate to the task. The morning was progressing normally when the two vessels began their approach toward each other. The Mont-Blanc, inbound to the harbor, was moving through the Narrows. The Imo, outbound and having completed her loading, was proceeding toward the open ocean. Both captains understood the basic principles of navigation and maritime law. Both had navigated through Halifax Harbor multiple times. Both were operating within what they understood to be normal wartime conditions. What neither captain fully appreciated was the extraordinary volatility of their meeting po. The Mont-Blanc carried not merely cargo, but concentrated destructive potential. 230 tons of TNT represented the explosive equivalent of multiple artillery barrages, and that was only the primary component of her cargo. The benzol would accelerate the burning process. The picric acid and gun cotton would amplify the force of detonation. These materials, when combined and ignited, would release energy comparable to the largest explosions the world had yet witnessed outside of volcanic activity. The harbor itself, while familiar to thousands of mariners, had certain characteristics that would prove tragically significant. The Narrows were relatively confined, channeling traffic through a restricted waterway. The surrounding areas were densely populated. On the Halifax side, residential neighborhoods climbed the hills overlooking the water. Wooden buildings predominated in the construction of the era. Commercial establishments, warehouses, and industrial facilities clustered along the waterfront. Schools, churches, and hospitals operated throughout the city without special protection or reinforcement against explosion. The civilian population went about their morning routines unaware of the cargo being transported through their harbor. The maritime authorities in Halifax operated within standard wartime procedures. Harbor pilots guided vessels through the Narrows. Signal stations communicated between ships and shore. The system had been designed for the efficient movement of shipping traffic, not for the management of extraordinary hazards. No special protocols existed for vessels carrying explosives beyond the standard requirement that such cargo be properly documented and secured. The assumption underlying all harbor operations was that ships would maintain their courses, follow established procedures, and that the system itself would prevent disaster. Yet the preconditions for catastrophe were assembling themselves. Two large vessels were moving toward an intersection. WW1 carried concentrated explosives of unprecedented quantity. The harbor was crowded with other traffic. The morning was advancing toward 9 o'clock. The civilian population of Halifax was engaged in its ordinary activities, moving through streets, attending school, working in shops and offices, performing the countless small actions that constitute a city's daily functioning. The origins of this particular moment lay not in Halifax itself, but in the broader context of the First World War. The war had created unprecedented demand for explosives. Industrial capacity had expanded to meet this demand. Supply lines had been established to transport war materials across the Atlantic. Halifax, as a major North American port, had become a critical node in this supply network. The Mont-Blanc represented not an isolated occurrence, but rather one ship among hundreds making similar journeys. The cargo she carried was one manifestation of the vast industrial apparatus that modern warfare had created. The morning of December 6, 1917, held no obvious portent of the transformation about to occur. The city was functioning as it had for the previous 3 years of war, busy, purposeful, oriented toward the military effort, but fundamentally routine. No warning system existed to alert the population to danger. No evacuation procedures had been established. The casual confidence that characterized the harbor's operations that morning was based on the assumption that systems designed for normal times would adequately serve wartime conditions. In approximately 20 minutes, this assumption would be tested against the reality of 230 tons of TNT. The morning of December 6, 1917, broke cold and gray over Halifax Harbor. The winter air bit at exposed skin as dock workers, stevedores, and harbor pilots moved through their routines with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to the perpetual movement of wartime commerce. Ships arrived daily, some departing laden with supplies and soldiers bound for the trenches of France. Others came seeking shelter, repair, or provisions. Halifax had become the nervous heart of Canada's war effort, a place where the distant thunder of European guns translated into urgent maritime traffic and the constant hum of military preparation. The SS Mont-Blanc was no ordinary vessel. French-flagged and riding low in the water, she carried a cargo that made even experienced sailors uneasy. 2,300 tons of picric acid, TNT, and benzol, enough explosive force to level city blocks. The shipment was destined for the Western Front, where the endless, grinding warfare consumed ammunition at rates that seemed to defy comprehension. Military planners calculated tonnages the way farmers measured grain, and Halifax Harbor served as the crucial funnel through which these deadly shipments flowed toward Europe. The SS Imo was returning from New York, carrying relief supplies for Belgium. She was a neutral vessel, though in the context of total war, neutrality existed in increasingly narrow corridors. The Imo moved through the harbor approaches with the confidence of a ship that had made this passage numerous times before. Her captain and pilot followed established procedures, navigating the narrows that led into the inner harbor where the Mont-Blanc waited. At 8:45 in the morning, the two vessels collided. The impact itself was not catastrophic, a grinding of metal, a shudder of displacement, the kind of harbor accident that occurred with unfortunate regularity in busy wartime ports. But the collision opened the Mont-Blanc's hull. Cargo that had been secured in careful stowage began to shift and mix. Picric acid contacted benzol. Chemical reactions began their inexorable progression, heat building incrementally within the damaged hold. Smoke began to rise from the French vessel's interior. The crew of the Mont-Blanc recognized immediately what was happening. They understood the nature of their cargo with the clarity that comes from understanding mortality. Some sources indicate that the captain ordered the ship toward shore, hoping to beach her and minimize the disaster. Others suggest confusion reigned in those crucial minutes as the crew grappled with the accelerating catastrophe unfolding beneath their feet. What is certain is that the Mont-Blanc drifted toward Pier 2, smoke now billowing from her holds in thick columns visible across the harbor. Workers on the dock began evacuating. The word spread through the warehouses and loading areas with the speed of genuine terror. An explosion was coming. Everyone understood this with the primitive clarity of people who worked around explosives and understood their nature. Some ran toward the city proper. Some ran toward the water, thinking that distance might offer protection. Some stood frozen, caught between fear and the human tendency to disbelieve catastrophe even as it unfolds directly before one's eyes. At 9 o'clock, the Mont-Blanc's cargo reached critical temperature. The chemical reactions that had begun at the moment of collision accelerated beyond the point of reversal. The ship's hold became an oven. The temperature climbed toward ignition. In those final seconds before 9 o'clock and 4 minutes and 35 seconds, the crew still aboard made their calculations about survival and escape. Some jumped into the harbor. Some ran toward the rail, seeking any avenue of survival. The explosion came at 9 o'clock and 4 minutes and 35 seconds in the morning. It was, in that moment, the largest man-made explosion in human history. No atomic bomb had yet been detonated. No thermonuclear device had yet demonstrated the terrible mathematics of nuclear fission. The Mont-Blanc's cargo of conventional explosives represented the apex of what conventional warfare could achieve in terms of instantaneous destructive force. The explosion was not a single event, but a cascading series of detonations that fed upon themselves. Picric acid, TNT, and benzol combined in a chain reaction that released energy on a scale difficult for the human mind to comprehend. The blast wave traveled outward at supersonic speed, carrying temperatures that could ignite buildings from the heat radiation alone. The pressure wave followed, capable of collapsing lungs, rupturing organs, and reducing human beings to components indistinguishable from the debris surrounding them. The sound was heard in communities 50 miles distant. In the city of Halifax itself, the effect was apocalyptic. Windows shattered across the entire city. Buildings constructed with brick and stone simply ceased to exist in certain neighborhoods. Wooden structures were reduced to splinters. The blast wave picked up human beings and hurled them through the air like leaves caught in a hurricane. Those standing too close to the epicenter were simply vaporized, leaving only shadows burned into surfaces, the final tragic photographs of their positions at the moment of detonation. In the immediate aftermath, the city existed in a state of shock that transcended even the normal human response to catastrophe. Fires erupted across the devastated areas. The railroad yards near the harbor were reduced to twisted metal and burning wreckage. The schools that had been in session at that morning hour became scenes of indescribable tragedy. Children who had been at their desks were buried under collapsed masonry. Teachers who had been teaching lessons about arithmetic or history or literature were killed instantly, their last moments spent in the ordinary act of education. The casualty figures began to accumulate almost immediately. Approximately 1,600 people were killed instantly in those first seconds after 9 o'clock and 4 minutes and 35 seconds. The dead included dock workers, stevedores, sailors, soldiers, civilians caught on the streets, children in schools, patients in the Victoria General Hospital, and countless others going about the ordinary business of living in a city at war. But the initial death toll was only the beginning. Over the subsequent days and weeks, as injuries claimed those who had survived the initial blast, the total death toll climbed to approximately 1,950 to 2,000 people. The injured numbered around 9,000, many of them bearing wounds of terrible severity. Blindness struck hundreds who had been looking toward the harbor when the flash came. Shrapnel embedded itself in flesh and bone, creating wounds that challenged the medical knowledge of the era. The immediate response was one of desperate improvisation. Physicians from across the region began arriving within hours, many traveling by train through the snow that had begun to fall on the afternoon of December 6th. Over 150 physicians and 170 nurses converged on Halifax, seeking to address a medical catastrophe that overwhelmed every established hospital and medical facility in the city. The Victoria General Hospital itself had been damaged in the explosion, adding to the chaos of the response. The relief efforts began immediately, though they took place in conditions of profound difficulty. The streets were choked with debris. The wounded lay in the snow, their cries adding to the sounds of rescue work and the continuing fires that burned across the devastated areas. Temporary hospitals were established in schools, churches, and any building that still stood. Surgeons worked without rest, performing amputations and emergency procedures by lamplight as darkness fell on that terrible day. The political ramifications began immediately as well. Questions arose about how such a catastrophe could have occurred. Investigations began into the circumstances of the collision, the procedures followed by harbor pilots, the decisions made by ship captains and crews. The wartime context complicated everything. The need to maintain morale, the imperative to continue military operations, the desire to assign blame, and the necessity to prevent future disasters all competed for attention in the minds of political and military leaders. The weather, which had been cold but clear in the morning, deteriorated rapidly. Snow began to fall on the afternoon of December 6th and continued through the 7th and 8th of December. The blizzard created its own crisis. Rescue workers struggled through snow and darkness to reach survivors. The cold claimed additional victims who might have survived had help arrived sooner or had temperatures been warmer, but the snow also, in a perverse way, helped to conceal the full extent of the devastation. Those arriving to help could not immediately comprehend the scale of destruction because the snow covered and obscured much of the wreckage. The city of Halifax, which had been a center of military efficiency and wartime purpose, became overnight a city of grief and trauma. Families searched through the devastation for loved ones. Identification of the dead became a macabre process, with bodies laid out in temporary morgues and warehouses, many of them so damaged that identification was possible only through personal effects or dental records. The social fabric of the city was torn apart by the sudden loss of so many people from all walks of life. In the broader context of the war, the explosion represented a kind of catastrophe that had not been anticipated in the strategic calculations of military planners. The war in Europe continued its grinding progression toward the eventual armistice. But in Halifax, the war had come home in a way that transcended the usual understanding of enemy action or military operations. The disaster was an accident, a tragic confluence of circumstances and cargo and human decisions made in the chaos of wartime. Yet the response also demonstrated the capacity for human resilience and compassion in the face of unprecedented tragedy. Medical personnel worked beyond exhaustion to treat the wounded. Rescue workers dug through rubble in conditions of profound difficulty. Communities across the region mobilized to provide aid and relief. The disaster, while terrible beyond measure, also revealed the bonds of human solidarity that could emerge even in the darkest circumstances. The crisis that unfolded on December 6, 1917, and in the days that followed, marked a turning point not only for Halifax, but for Canada's understanding of the costs of modern industrial warfare. The explosion demonstrated with terrible clarity that warfare in the 20th century could reach beyond battlefields and trenches to strike at civilian populations and civilian infrastructure. The lessons learned in Halifax would influence thinking about military logistics, harbor safety, and civilian protection in the years and decades to come. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion that occurred at 9:04 and 35 seconds on the morning of December 6, 1917, Halifax became a landscape of unimaginable suffering. The blast had transformed a thriving military port into a scene of biblical devastation. Approximately 1,600 souls perished in that first catastrophic instant, their lives extinguished in a fraction of a second. The shockwave that radiated outward from the harbor had obliterated buildings, splintered trees, and turned everyday objects into lethal projectiles. Windows shattered across the entire city and beyond. Fires erupted simultaneously across multiple districts. The air itself seemed to have turned hostile, filled with ash, smoke, and the dust of pulverized structures. Yet even as the smoke rose into the winter sky, Even as the full scope of the devastation became apparent, the response from across Canada and beyond demonstrated the capacity for human compassion and organized relief in the face of catastrophe. The medical response began almost immediately. Over 150 physicians and 170 nurses arrived by train within hours of the explosion, mobilizing from surrounding regions to provide emergency care to the 9,000 injured who desperately needed medical attention. These medical professionals worked in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, operating in hospitals that were themselves damaged, treating injuries of a severity and scale that exceeded anything most had encountered in their careers. The first 48 hours following the explosion were chaotic and desperate. Rescue workers moved through the rubble searching for survivors. They pulled bodies from the wreckage, many of them beyond recovery. They carried the injured to makeshift hospitals and medical stations. They searched for missing children, parents, spouses, and friends. The weather, which had been clear and cold on the morning of the explosion, turned hostile. Beginning on December 7th and continuing through December 8th, a severe blizzard descended upon Halifax. The snow fell heavily, accumulating rapidly across the devastated landscape. This blizzard, while hindering rescue efforts and creating additional suffering for those still trapped or exposed, also served an unexpected function. It concealed the full extent of the devastation from those observing the city from a distance, creating a strange isolation that paradoxically allowed rescue workers to focus on their immediate tasks without the overwhelming weight of witnessing the complete destruction all at once. The casualty figures grew as the days passed. What had begun as approximately 1,600 dead in the initial explosion eventually rose to approximately 1,950 to 2,000 confirmed deaths. The injured numbered around 9,000 individuals. These figures represented not merely statistics, but rather the destruction of entire families, the obliteration of neighborhoods, the loss of a generation of young people. Many of the dead were dock workers and stevedores who had been laboring in the harbor when the Mont-Blanc struck the Imo. Many were school children attending classes in buildings that collapsed. Many were women and children sheltering in their homes when the blast wave struck. The explosion had discriminated based neither on age nor on innocence, nor on any factor other than proximity to ground zero. The wartime context of the explosion added layers of complexity to the tragedy. Halifax was, in 1917, a crucial military nerve center for Canadian operations in the First World War. The city served as a primary port for the embarkation of Canadian troops and the receipt of supplies destined for the Western Front. The explosion occurred during a period when the war had already claimed millions of lives across Europe. The loss of 2,000 Canadians in a single instant, not through enemy action, but through a catastrophic accident born from the chaos of wartime operations, struck at the heart of Canadian civilian society. The war, which had seemed distant to many Canadians living in cities far from the Atlantic coast, suddenly became viscerally real. The political consequences of the explosion rippled through Canadian society. Questions arose immediately about responsibility, about how such a catastrophe could have occurred, about what safeguards should have been in place. The collision between the Mont-Blanc and the Imo had not been an act of God, but rather a sequence of human decisions and errors. The Mont-Blanc had been loaded with explosives in Halifax Harbor. The decision to load and store munitions in such proximity to a civilian population had been made by military and political authorities. The collision itself had occurred due to navigational errors and communication failures between the two vessels. These facts became increasingly apparent as investigations proceeded in the days and weeks following the explosion. The investigation into the causes of the explosion became a matter of intense public scrutiny. The Canadian government, the Halifax authorities, and the Naval Command all came under pressure to explain how such a disaster had been allowed to occur. The investigation revealed that the Mont Blanc had been carrying approximately 2,300 tons of explosives, including TNT, picric acid, and benzol. This extraordinary quantity of munitions had been stored in the harbor in close proximity to civilian areas and residential neighborhoods. The Imo, a Norwegian vessel, had been preparing to depart the harbor when the collision occurred. The exact sequence of events that led to the collision involved disagreements about navigational rights in the narrow harbor channel and failures in communication between the two vessels. In the aftermath of the explosion and investigation, recommendations emerged regarding maritime safety and the handling of explosives in populated areas. While these recommendations were not universally implemented immediately, they represented an acknowledgement that the catastrophe had revealed serious gaps in safety protocols and regulatory oversight. The tragedy became a cautionary tale about the dangers of conducting military operations in close proximity to civilian populations, a lesson that would resonate through the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The relief efforts that followed the explosion demonstrated the capacity for organized compassion in the face of disaster. The Canadian Red Cross mobilized resources to provide aid to survivors. Relief trains arrived carrying medical supplies, food, blankets, and clothing. Donations poured in from across Canada and from international sources. The United States, despite being a belligerent in the First World War, fighting on the same side as Canada, sent relief supplies and medical personnel to assist in the recovery efforts. This international cooperation, in the face of humanitarian crisis, transcended the political divisions of the war. The rebuilding of Halifax proceeded gradually over the months and years following the explosion. The physical reconstruction of buildings and infrastructure was undertaken, but the psychological and emotional reconstruction of the community proved far more complex and prolonged. Survivors carried trauma that would persist for decades. Families had been shattered. Entire neighborhoods had been obliterated. Orphaned children faced uncertain futures. Widows struggled to rebuild their lives. The social fabric of the community had been torn apart with a violence that defied easy repair. The stories of individual survivors and victims became woven into the collective memory of Halifax and of Canada more broadly. There were stories of remarkable rescue efforts, of individuals who had been pulled from the rubble after hours or even days of being trapped. There were stories of medical personnel who had worked tirelessly despite their own injuries and trauma. There were stories of the generosity of strangers who had opened their homes to those rendered homeless by the explosion. There were also stories of profound loss, of families who had been entirely eliminated, of entire bloodlines erased in a single moment. The explosion occurred at a moment when the First World War had already transformed the world profoundly. The war had introduced industrial-scale killing, had normalized the deaths of hundreds of thousands and millions, had fundamentally altered the relationship between nations, between governments and citizens, between the possibility of peace and the reality of organized violence. The Halifax explosion, while dwarfed by the scale of casualties occurring daily on the Western Front, carried a particular significance because it was a catastrophe that had befallen civilians, that had occurred not in the chaos of battle, but in a harbor in a Canadian city. It stood as a stark reminder of the costs of war, even for those not directly engaged in combat. As the years and decades passed following 1917, the Halifax explosion took on increasing historical significance. It came to be understood as the largest man-made explosion prior to the development of nuclear weapons. The explosion that occurred at 9:04 and 35 seconds on that December morning in 1917 had released energy that exceeded all previous human-created explosions. This fact alone made it historically notable, but its true significance lay not in the magnitude of the blast, but in what it revealed about human vulnerability and human resilience. The memory of the explosion became embedded in Halifax's identity as a city. December 6th became a day of remembrance, a day on which the city paused to honor those who had been lost and to acknowledge the survivors who had endured the catastrophe. Memorials were erected, stories were preserved, the lessons learned from the tragedy influenced how subsequent generations approached maritime safety, the handling of explosives, and the responsibility of governments to protect civilian populations from unnecessary risks. The explosion also became part of the broader narrative of Canada during the First World War. It stood alongside other stories of sacrifice and loss that characterized Canadian participation in the conflict. While most Canadian casualties occurred on the battlefields of Europe, the Halifax explosion demonstrated that war exacted costs on the home front as well, that the mobilization of entire nations for warfare created dangers and vulnerabilities that extended far beyond the trenches. The explosion was a consequence of Canada's participation in the First World War, a consequence of the decisions made to produce munitions in Halifax and to transport explosives through the harbor. The wartime secret that had been implicit in the story of the Halifax explosion was the fact that military authorities had knowingly placed a civilian population at risk in order to serve the war effort. The explosives aboard the Mont-Blanc were destined for use against Germany and its allies. The war effort required the production and transportation of vast quantities of munitions. Halifax, as a major port city, became a crucial node in this logistical network. The decision to load and store explosives in the harbor reflected priorities in which military necessity had been weighed against civilian safety, and military necessity had prevailed. In the decades following the explosion, historians and scholars studied the event from multiple perspectives, seeking to understand not only what had happened, but why it had happened, and what it revealed about the society that had allowed it to occur. The explosion became a subject of academic inquiry, a case study in disaster response, a meditation on the relationship between military operations and civilian vulnerability. Books were written, documentaries were produced, survivor testimonies were recorded. The explosion, which had occurred in a moment, became a historical event that would be examined and re-examined across generations. The legacy of the Halifax explosion extended beyond Canada. The disaster demonstrated to the world the catastrophic potential of industrial explosives when accidents occurred. The explosion influenced international discussions about maritime safety and the transportation of hazardous materials. It contributed to the development of more rigorous protocols for handling explosives and for preventing collisions in harbors. While these improvements came too late for the nearly 2,000 people who had died on December 6, 1917, they represented an acknowledgement that such catastrophes could be mitigated through careful planning, regulation, and oversight. The survivors of the explosion, the 9,000 individuals who had been injured and had recovered, or who had carried their injuries throughout their lives, became living testimonies to both the violence of the explosion and the capacity of the human body to endure and recover. Many of these survivors went on to rebuild their lives, to raise families, to contribute to their communities. Their stories of recovery and resilience became part of the collective narrative of Halifax. Stories that spoke to human capacity to persist in the face of overwhelming tragedy. As the 20th century progressed, and the memories of those who had directly experienced the explosion began to fade with the passage of time, the Halifax explosion took on the character of historical memory rather than lived experience. It became a story told in schools, a narrative in history books, a reference point for understanding disaster and recovery. Yet the fundamental human truths embedded in the story remained constant. The fragility of human life, the capacity for catastrophe to strike suddenly and without warning, the necessity of compassion and cooperation in the aftermath of disaster, and the enduring power of memory to preserve the stories of those who had suffered. The explosion that occurred at 9:04 and 35 seconds on the morning of December 6, 1917, had lasted only an instant, but its consequences extended across generations. The nearly 2,000 people who had been killed in that instant represented lives that had been interrupted, families that had been shattered, futures that would never be realized. The 9,000 injured carried physical and psychological scars that would persist for decades. The city of Halifax carried the weight of collective trauma. Yet the city also demonstrated the capacity to rebuild, to remember, and to extract meaning from tragedy. The Halifax explosion stands as a historical marker, a moment at which the costs of modern warfare and industrial society became tangible and undeniable. It reminds us that catastrophe can strike suddenly, that safety cannot be assumed, and that the protection of civilian populations must remain a paramount concern. The wartime secret that had been implicit in the explosion was revealed in its aftermath, that governments and military authorities make decisions that place civilians at risk in pursuit of military objectives, and that the consequences of these decisions can be devastating and far-reaching. The story of the Halifax explosion is ultimately a story about the human capacity to endure, to remember, and to seek meaning in suffering. It is a story that continues to resonate across the generations that followed that cold December morning, when Halifax was forever transformed by an explosion that would echo through history. Thank you so much for joining me today and diving into this incredible chapter of World War I history with me. I really hope you enjoyed learning about these stories that shaped our world. If this video resonated with you, I'd love it if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and helps me keep bringing these important stories to life. I genuinely love to hear your thoughts too. Drop a comment below and let me know what you found most interesting, or if there's a WW1 story you'd like me to explore next. Trust me, we've got so many more fascinating tales coming your way. The history of the Great War is endless, and I can't wait to share them with you. So stay curious and keep learning. I'll see you next time.